So it struck me for quite a long time that good vampire novels are surprisingly hard to find considering how popular the vampire is. Of course, part of that might have to do with my personal criteria for being a vampire novel or vampire literature in general. First of all, it needs to be a book about vampires, not a book that just happens to have vampires as a main part of the cast. So Pratchett's Carpe Ugolum has vampires as the main villains, but it's not about vampires. Same with the Dresden Files series, same with the Graveyard Book. The other thing that's very important to me in vampire literature to make it feel like real vampire literature is that it has the feeling of eternity and the danger of bloodlust. So I did once come across a book where our protagonist was a vampire, but he just felt like some modern guy. Not even some modern guy who's just crawled his way out of the grave and has eternity waiting for him. Just a guy. And it didn't feel like a vampire. I actually stopped reading. I was like, this isn't a vampire. You can't tell me it is. I think where this came from, for me at least, was the fact that I grew up with the novel of Dracula and the TV show Forever Knight, which is a Canadian TV show in which Nick Knight is an 800-year-old vampire who also happens to be a detective with the Toronto police force. And this combination of, even though he's trying to be a good guy, the bloodlust is coming over, and the weight of years and the past and the relationships that are built over all this time are important. And I should mention here that on my list, I have a list, there is one of the stories has a vampire who's a brand new vampire at the beginning of the book. He's literally crawling out of his grave in the beginning, but it still has that feeling of eternity. So it is possible and it is important. So, with those things said, I have my list of 10. I'll start with number 10 and work my way up to my absolute number 1 pick for best vampire novel I have ever read. Number 10. Prisoner of Vampires by Nancy Garden. This is actually one of two, and I think slightly better, of the two books, vampire books written by Nancy Garden. It is for maybe 8+, and is simply exactly what it sounds like. A boy meets vampires and ends up as their prisoner and has to figure out how to get out of the situation if he can. It is cute, it is fun, it is lightweight. It ultimately didn't go quite where I want it to go, but otherwise, yeah, I definitely recommend it. Number 9. Companions of the Night by Vivian van de Velde. Vivian van de Velde is one of my favorite authors. I like practically everything she's written, and although Companions of the Night is actually maybe at the midpoint for me of her writing, my absolute favorite being Wizard at Work, it's solid. I reread it and I enjoy it every time. Number 8 is actually right behind me, Twilight Forever Rising by Lena Maiden, whose name I may be butchering, translated from the Russian by Andrew Bromfield. Now, 2 caveats here. The first caveat is I only read this book once. It was about 4 years ago. The book is on my to-reread list. I haven't gotten there quite yet. But I remember it being pretty good. The other caveat is the book feels like it's in the middle of a series. I mean, you can definitely follow along with what's going on, but when I was reading it, I wondered, did I pick up book 2 or 3 in the series and tried to research it, and I don't speak Russian, but this is the only book of hers that's been translated into English, so it's probably book 1, and I just missed something, which maybe I'll catch at my reread and just wonder what I was thinking 4 years ago. Moving up to number 6. Number 6 is fairly randomly placed actually in the very good mid category here. It's simply 2 books of vampire short stories, and in each of these there are a couple of stories which are between very good and absolutely spectacular, and then of course there are some that are fine and a whole bunch that are almost unbelievably dreadful, which is true of practically every book of short stories I've ever come across. The story I mentioned at the beginning, where there's a brand new vampire just climbing out of the grave, is the high point of the short stories. It is essentially perfect. It's also the only Jewish vampire story I've come across. Now, to some extent, all of these stories that I'm mentioning are in the Dracula tradition, which is to say, the things that Dracula is vulnerable to, his strengths and weaknesses, are to some extent reflected in these. There may be variations, but it's recognizably from the same mythos. I have read books like vampire mythology around the world, but the stories I haven't really come across aside from in those sorts of books, which makes this a little bit of an outlier. Neither for better or for worse, it's just Blood Libel is the perfect short story. Next on the list is, well, these next three, I should say, are about equal in my mind. The first is Those Who Haunt the Night by Barbara Hambly. Those Who Haunt the Night is the beginning of a series. I believe it's the best of the series, although the next couple are quite good. After that, she tends to fall into a rut, which, you know, I didn't mind at that plot point the first time it happened, but it's happened for the past 5 novels, and I'm sort of over it now. But Those Who Want the Night is really an absolutely wonderful book in which a vampire strong-arms an ex-spy into working for him, but of course the ex-spy is not going to take that lying down, and so he's also trying to work against the vampire while he's working for him. It's tense, it's clever, it's well researched because it's set back in time, and I absolutely would recommend it, and at least its first couple of sequels. I would not recommend any of the sequels of this next book. This actually is something I should talk about at some point, which is how to ruin your book with your sequels. But this list is a good list, so I will say a very good book, and probably the second most famous book on this list is Interview with the Vampire. Now, I first heard of Interview with the Vampire while I was in middle school, and I didn't read it because I heard it was terribly scandalous. I did see actually the movie when I was a teenager, and I was like, what is this? I saw it again as an adult and absolutely loved it. One of my absolute top vampire movies, if not my top vampire movie. But the reason I read it was actually that Simon Vance is my favorite audiobook reader, and I was looking for audiobooks, and so I was actually searching by Mr. Vance's name, and I saw he'd done Interview with the Vampire. And I thought, okay. I've been curious about this story for a long time. I have vague, strange memories of the movie from 10 years ago. I'll give it a go. And I really enjoy it. I didn't want to stop listening. I couldn't listen quickly enough, and so I wanted to go out and buy a paperback so I could read it more quickly, but I couldn't actually find one in town. And I kept listening, and the really strange thing about it was that Simon Vance, who's English, was reading almost the entire thing in a French accent. And I was like, why? I mean, he doesn't do that for other books. That is strange. And then I finally saw the paperback version of the book. And if I were ranking these only by the paperback version, Interview with the Vampire would be a lot lower on the list, or a lot higher, I suppose, because it's an interview, the book. Almost every single paragraph in the entire book begins with quotation marks. And then when people speak, they're internal quotation marks. And then when people are quoting people, there's a third layer of quotation marks. And it is so immensely obnoxious that I probably wouldn't have gone past the first chapter if I'd read the paperback. So, I absolutely totally recommend the audiobook of the first book and the movie. But unless you can totally get past the quotation marks thing, maybe don't read the paperback version. Oh, I almost forgot. Next on my list, Talking of famous vampire books, how about Dracula? Dracula, it's not on the top of my list, although it's of course the most famous and influential. As a book, I do believe it has problems. You can see the problems most clearly by the fact that pretty much every adaptation ever keeps the first part with Jonathan's narration in Transylvania almost exactly like it happens in the book. Then they'll have a slightly different version of the Lucy story, and then the entire rest will be basically unrecognizable. There's a reason for that. The part with Jonathan at the beginning is by far the strongest, and the final climax is vague and uninteresting. And there are little bits throughout which are good, and I do think overall the book is definitely worth a reread. I have read it quite a few times, but it's not the perfect book. This next book, which would be, I guess, number 3 on the list, is a book I hesitated a little bit on whether to put in the very good category or in the absolute best category. And it ended up at the top of the very good category simply because it's quite dreary and bleak and depressing, and that means I don't want to reread it a lot. But that being said, it is very, very good. It's called The Vampire Tapestry, and it's a story in multiple parts which just tells the tale of a vampire who has come back after being asleep for a long time and his stint on Earth. And like actually with Those Who Hunt the Night, this book makes an attempt, instead of having your typical vampire legend and then trying to excuse it, the author tries to say, okay, if vampires exist and we have our current legends with them, how might that come about? How might vampires actually happen? Now, I have no problem with having variations on the vampire myth and having very different types. I don't have a problem with Twilight. Twilight has a feeling of eternity, and Twilight has the danger from bloodlust. It didn't make this list, but for me, the whole sparkle thing didn't ruin it. It was just another variation. In the same way, in the Vampire Tapestry, the vampire doesn't have fangs. Instead, he has a barb on his tongue, which is used to pierce his skin, which makes sense. And I'm okay with that. It's not my favorite. I like my vampires traditional, but it still counts as vampire for me. And although the bloodlust element isn't that strong, it has one of the strongest feelings of eternity of any of these books, which is probably part of why it's so depressing. But now we are down to the top 2, the 5 out of 5 stars, the absolute best, the I will reread them and reread them and reread them. Number 2 on the list is Sunshine by Robin McKinley. This is one of my more recent discoveries, more recent I say. Actually, it's probably been almost a decade. I've read it at least 4 times. It's just really good. I mean, to some extent, that's all you can say about a book that's really good, which is that it's really good. I suppose if I had to have a criticism of it, it's that there's no sequel and I want one. In fact, when Shadows came out, I thought, finally, a sequel to Sunshine, and then it turned out to be a completely unrelated book. Now we are down to it. My very favorite vampire novel of all time. A book I've read again and again for over 20 years. A book that is, in my opinion, perfect. It loves the vampire mythos. It understands the vampire mythos. It plays with it, and it incorporates pretty much every element to it. You want your vampires to drink blood, to have a sense of eternity, to be able to be killed by a beheading stake or sunlight? It has all of that. How about the counting obsession? How about transformations into mist, bat, and wolf? How about all those little things which the vampire obsessive enthusiasts know? And how do you make them all work? Well, I recommend reading How to Be a Vampire by R.L. Stine. I'm not joking. I'm not playing around. This, in some ways, is really what Prisoner of Vampires should be. It is essentially perfect. It loves its material, it honors its material, and it's just really, really well written. Well, I hope if there are any other vampire enthusiasts out there, you have found at least one new recommendation to seek out. And if you have recommendations for me, please do leave them in the comments. I look forward to reading them.